Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second appointment in the current cycle of the lessons, the discursive format accompanying the exhibitions at the Paintings Gallery. My name is Susanne Watzenberg. I'm working as a curatorial assistant in the collections, and it is my pleasure to briefly introduce tonight's speaker, Kravagna. Kravagna is an art historian, a critic, and a curator since 2006, working here in the Academy of Fine Arts as a professor for post-colonial studies. Prior to this, he has held positions as a visiting professor and a lecturer at the University of Vienna, the Universities of Zurich and Lüneburg, the University of Applied Arts Vienna, and the Art University of Linz. His main research fields are post-colonial studies, global modernisms, migration and politics of representation, as well as institutional critique. In tonight's lecture, he will take Willem de Rooij's installation King Vulture, which is currently on view upstairs in the Paintings Gallery, as a starting point for his explorations of the questions how colonial stereotypes are formed in different colonial cultures and their corresponding visual regimes. Special attention will be given to the Austrian expedition to Brazil, organized and financed by the Austrian Empire from 1817 to 1835, in which the artist Durch Enders participated and produced an impressive amount of artworks that can still today serve as an example for colonialism without colonies, as the Austrian one could be described. So without further ado, I hand over the floor to Kravagna. A very warm welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Thank you also to Sabine Folie for inviting me to give a talk here in the context of Willem de Rooij's insert in the Gemäldegalerie. And thank you all for coming, in particular on such a wonderful evening. That's really an honor. Thank you. And yeah, it's a bit strange to speak here from this kind of chairman of the House of Lords position. But anyway, I will try my best. So in thinking about the thematic approach for this lecture, I first thought of my earlier involvement with the work of Jeroen de Rijke and Willem de Rooij. For over 20 years, this work has been among the most substantial artistic engagements with the aftermath of colonialism on post-colonial societies, their concepts of community and their politics of identity. In 2005, I wrote an essay about their film Mandarin Ducks for the catalogue accompanying the exhibition at the Secession. You can currently see the film Mandarin Ducks in the exhibition on stage at the MUMOC. The text was titled The Post-Colonial Group Portrait because I approached de Rijke de Rooij's allegorical consideration of the abyss of Dutch society on the ruins of the colonial empire and its repression via Alois Riegel's famous essay on the Dutch group portrait in the 16th and 17th century. Mandarin Ducks did a striking updating of Riegel's analysis of the representation of community in the early bourgeois social order, an update for the post-migrant society of the 21st century. In recent years, Willem de Rooij has focused on Dutch painting of the so-called Golden Age, which was founded on global trade, colonial expansion, and plantation economies based on slavery. What the age gilded for the Dutch and meant liberation from Spanish Habsburg rule meant extinction for many indigenous Americans and reification and social death for many enslaved Africans, as Orlando Patterson put it. Willem de Rooij's King Vulture in the Gemäldegalerie is part of his examination of the history of painting in the context of colonialism and early capitalism. In this case, there is a focus on animal painting and in particular the depiction of exotic birds in the art of Jan Wenigs, Melchior de Hundekutter and Dirk Valkenburg. The historical paintings in the exhibition are a product of Dutch colonialism, the eponymous king Vulture coming from their South American possessions. Willem de Rooij interrogates and comments on the images as significant artistic examples of what could be called the natural history of European colonialism. Despite my appreciation for de Rooij's contribution to the critical understanding of this history, I will not deal directly with the exhibition itself today, but rather take up a particular aspect in order to establish a connection to phenomena of Austrian colonial history and its persistence in exhibition practices of the present. For this purpose, I will once again jump to the time of the secession exhibition of die Rijke de Rooij, because in the same year of 2005, at the Academy where I had just started teaching, there was an exhibition that motivated me to give my first public lecture at this school. While Willem de Rooij deals with artistic manifestations of Dutch colonialism in Brazil and Suriname, the exhibition of the Academy referred to the Austrian expedition to Brazil in the early 19th century. The exhibition, The Brazilian-Expedition of Thomas Ender Reconsidered, emerged from a project of the artist Mark Diane with students of the Academy. Together they traveled in 2004 in the footsteps of the painter Thomas Ender, who had accompanied the diplomatic scientific expedition of the Austrians to Brazil in the years 1817-18. Their presentation included their own artistic reflections of this experience, as you can see here on this slide, but also loans of objects from the historical expedition from the Museum of Natural History and the Museum of Ethnology, as well as watercolors by Ender from the Kupferstichkabinett. I will later discuss the problematic nature of this project and why I considered it kind of exemplary of the Austrian culture of belittling the colonial. But first, let us recall some characteristics of colonial nature painting. Through the example of the king vulture in Dutch painting, Willem de Rooij demonstrates the process of repetition of images as a process of reduction of variety and increasing solidification. In Jan Wenigs' work, the South American vulture is always depicted in the same form. Regardless of the infinite variety of the animal's freedom of movement in its habitat, the vulture's pose becomes a pattern that painters reproduce. European painters, respectively their patrons and buyers, are fascinated by the exoticism of American nature, but they do not depict living nature, but the arrested, domesticated version. The vulture in the same pose over and over again emanates little more life than the taxidermied vulture in the Natural History collection. The killing of the bird, its transatlantic transport, and its taxidermy for viewing and study in Europe form the physical material analog to the freezing of foreign fauna in the cliched image of colonial painting. Both worlds of birds, the naturalistic as well as the artistic, represent what I would call the disalienation of nature in the colonized territories, the appropriation and classification into systems of modern representation and classification. What we see is the result of a transformation of the foreign into a stereotypical image. The richness of appearances is replaced by the reproduction of the imprint as a result of constriction and ossification. The signs form conventions that meet the expectation of a certain audience. Sander Gilman writes about how stereotypes work. The reception of a statement about reality depends on how well it fits into the web of conventions that links all representational systems within the culture. End quote. So when we talk about colonial stereotypes, we usually think of racist representations of people and cultures. I do not want to talk about that today, or only in passing. In the context of Willem de Rooij's contribution to the natural history of the colonial image, I am more interested in the colonial view of nature in the form of landscape and animals. Willem's artifice of having Jan Wenig's king vulture reproduced by a Chinese studio makes this process all the more visible. Painting is less the representation of nature than the reproduction of images. The involvement of a studio that reproduces well-known works of art history for clients may speak to the kinship of this practice of painting with the conditions of production of painting around 1700, which were very different from our modern conception of the artist, as Vanessa Müller points out in her contribution to the booklet on the exhibition. I'm interested in a somewhat different aspect of this, namely Willem's splitting of the artistic role image into two poles. On the one hand, there is the autonomous artist who develops his concepts, procedures, and aesthetics himself. That is Willem de Rooij. On the other side is the painter's workshop, which executes what others want it to do. The purely commissioned artist and the free artist. The reproductive artist and the innovative artist stand opposite each other as poles of a binary opposition of the artist's role. I do not think that the role of the artist in the 17th and 18th centuries can be compared with the way the Chinese studio works today. It seems to me more accurate to see in the painters of this era traits of both sides. With the described process of narrowing the images, painting works against its own interest. The artistic contribution to the web of conventions that make up the colonial worldview of a society then takes precedence over the painterly interest in the fascinating landscape, fauna, and flora overseas. The painter within the painter has an interest in the new, in the particularity of the phenomena, and he wants to get close to them with their means. But the possibility of unfolding is limited by the framing narratives of power and subjugation, of the profit and prestige-oriented rendering of nature and people, useful in the colonial encounter with the other. In the colonial dispositive, the artist as service provider counteracts the artist as painter. I understand the paintings in Willem de Rooij's exhibition as examples from Dutch painting around 1700, marking the provisionally concluded conflict between the painter and the commissioned artist, between the interest in the other and its schematic narrowing. Let us quote Sander Gilman again. Every social group has a certain repertoire of retrievable images of the externalized other. These images are a product of history as well as a culture that perpetuates them. It is not least through repetition in the corresponding dispositive of power that emerges what Michel Foucault called a regime of truth. With reference to this concept of Foucault, Edward Said described Orientalism as such a system of repetition, citation, and minor deviation in relation to the other, as he called it, a system of knowledge about the Orient, an accepted grid of filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. Analogous to Said's Orientalism, Americanism also proves to be an accepted grid for filtering through the South American continent. Willem de Rooij refers to Dutch colonial painting from around 1700. Our Austrian example with Thomas Ender dates from the early 19th century. Revealing, however, are those paintings in which the process of the colonization of painting has not yet been completed. Today, we are often concerned with the question of how art and visual culture can leave behind their colonial imprint. We speak of the decolonization of representation. But we must also ask in what way the colonization of art took place in the first place. Let us therefore look back at the beginnings of colonial landscape painting in the context of the Dutch wars against the Spanish and Portuguese, which these wars occurred in South Asia, Africa, and South America from the beginning of the 17th century. American landscape painting has its origins in the colonial sugar wars. Franz Post is considered the originator of the American landscape. From 1637 to 1644, the Dutch painter accompanied Count Johann Maurits van Nassau on his military expedition to Brazil, which disputed part of the sugar trade controlled by the Portuguese. Like his colleague Albert Eckhout, who was responsible for the botanical and ethnographic images, Franz Post, who was commissioned to paint landscapes, but also to document the conquest, was one of the first embedded painters in the history of art and colonialism. I use the term in analogy to the embedded journalists who were trained by the US Army during the US-Iraq War in 2003 and then reported independence of the military. The painter is always a painter, but he is also a part of the political military machine. Of the 140 or so Brazilian landscapes that Franz Post produced during his lifetime, only 6 or 7 were done on location in Brazil. These Brazilian paintings are almost all in the Louvre today. They are characterized by a low horizon, a few layered, homogeneous areas suffice for the composition of the picture. People, animals, and plants stand out clearly from the ground. They seem somewhat stiff and isolated. I find these quiet pictures with their white spaces fascinating. They bear witness to a stranger's attempt to come close to the strangeness of appearance with the means at his disposal. What makes these paintings interesting is also a certain awkwardness, like when a person tries to express themselves in a foreign language. The painter does not master the subject. He has not yet found the manner which requires a certain routine. In contrast to the few paintings executed in Brazil, the painter endows his canvases created after his return with an abundance of signifiers of the tropical. Foreground and margins of the picture are now regularly animated by all kinds of exotic animals and plants. Ant-eaters, armadillos, flamingos, lizards, monkeys, and rabbit-eating snakes now inhabit an exotic botanical garden. No picture can now do without palm trees, even though the palm trees do not appear in any of the paintings he did in Brazil. The painting Brazilian landscape with sugar mill is significant. It presents a whole sample catalogue of tropical plants and animals. Post was very successful in the 17th century European art market with these American landscape fantasies. Since since its foundation by Post, writes art historian Luis Perez Oramas, the American landscape was marked by a type of otherness, turning it into a form and figure of fiction. We should take this formulation seriously. It accurately describes what we had already been thinking about, the transition from the curious and somewhat awkward observation of alien reality to the elaboration of a painterly catalogue of typical elements that can be combined in a variety of ways. Otherness is then no longer a challenge to find an appropriate language. Instead, it becomes a cliché, a scheme that can in principle be endlessly repeated and varied. The title of the exhibition, The Brazilian-Expedition of Thomas Ender, Reconsidered, 2004 at the Academy, suggested the reconsideration of a scientific expedition under imperialist conditions, a necessary undertaking, especially in Austria. 4 years before the Academy exhibition, a large exhibition entitled The Discovery of the World of Discoveries, was on display, organized by the Federal Ministry of Education and carried out by the Kunsthistorisches Museum, Naturhistorisches Museum, Heeresgeschichtliches Museum, and Völkerkundemuseum. The exhibition, which opened symbolically on National Day, aimed to highlight Austria's part in the discovery and exploration of the world. Heroic explorer myth and adventurous spirit characterized the exhibition. The usual Austrian not us when it comes to colonialism, because we didn't have any colonies, was to be completed by a triumphant we too, with reference to the seemingly positive sides of European world exploration. The Austrian-Brazilian expedition was also part of the exhibition at the Künstlerhaus. Thomas Ender, who studied painting at the Academy and later became a professor here, took part in an expedition in 1817-18 organized by State Chancellor Metternich on the occasion of the marriage of Archduchess Leopoldine and the Crown Prince of Portugal and Brazil. Ender executed more than 1,000 Brazilian drawings and watercolors, most of which are now in our graphic collection. The other participants pursued mineralogical, geographical, botanical, zoological, and ostensibly ethnographic research. Above all, however, in accordance with the state mandate, they collected on a large scale over 150,000 objects. So almost 200 years later, the artist Mark Dion and some students set out on the trail of Thomas Ender in Rio de Janeiro and the surrounding area. They were accompanied by Ender expert Robert Wagner. Each participant took on the role of a historical predecessor, botanist, landscape painter, zoologist, and so on. The exhibition was divided into 2 eras. To the right of the entrance area, the artistic results of the journey were displayed. To the left of them, Ender's watercolors and some showcases with loans from museums related to the historical expedition. In his exhibition text, Mark Dion wrote, "The project made use of the somewhat anachronistic model of the expedition, for which several people with different talents and specializations come together as a group to bring their intellectual and physical resources to bear for a common purpose." The mentioned purpose of the company was not further defined. The historical part of the contemporary part with the students and Mark Dion's works were clearly separated from each other. The historical part with the objects from the museum collections and Ender's paintings avoided any commentary. Things should probably speak for themselves. Instead of a critical re-examination of history, the expedition of 1817 seemed to be filed away in history via a few exhibits, as if it were in good hands there. Colonialism encompasses a broad spectrum of practices and discourses that have organized the power relations between Europe and other world regions over 5 centuries. the possession of overseas territories and their systematic administration, control, and exploitation is only one part of this spectrum, albeit is a central one, of course. In addition, and closely related to it, exist political, economic, scientific, ideological, popular, cultural, and artistic undertakings, representations, and institutions that support and frame political military colonialism, sometimes preceded and sometimes outlasted. The development and exploitation of world trade, the exploration and exploitation of distant regions, the missionizing, enslaving, or anthropometrically surveying of people involved not only those European powers whose names appeared on colonial maps, but governments, interest groups, institutions, media, and individuals from all over Europe. Thus, to state that Austria had no colonies does not mean that it was not involved in the colonial project. The colonial consciousness and/or the colonial imaginary unfold somewhat differently in the institutions, the media, and the citizens of a country like Austria than in those of a colonial power in the stricter sense. But it unfolds historically and was constantly fed anew. In 2009, Arabah Evelyn Johnston Arthur wrote, referring to the widespread discourse of denial in this society, I quote, "Austria floats in the heart of Europe in a neutral vacuum, untouched by any colonial discourse." The Brazil-Expedition of the early 19th century, organized by Chancellor Metternich, stands in a series of colonial projects of the Habsburg monarchy. From the 17th to the 20th century, numerous attempts were made to give the Austrian Empire global standing and to derive corresponding economic profits from it. Under Maria Theresia, the Austrian East India Company was founded, with centers in Ostend and Trieste. Under the leadership of the Dutchman William Boltz, the Austrian East India Company controlled small territories in Southwest Africa and South Asia for a few years, mainly for the trade in ivory and the establishment of sugar plantations. Austrian colonies were established on the Nicobar Islands, which had previously been under Danish occupation, and in Delagoa Bay in what is now Mozambique, using both paid and enslaved labor. Under Maria Theresia, Austria's colonial policies, natural history collection, and exoticist worldviews in art merged for the first time. So these three, art, natural history, and the colonial projects proper, I think came together for the first time under Maria Theresia in the 18th century. So these are two examples of Johann Bergel's paintings in the summer residency of Maria Theresia in Vienna. He also painted in Schönbrunn some of these apartments of the Empress. And then there is another of these murals by Bergel, and a representation, a painting of Franz Stephan, who was the husband of Maria Theresia and who was the founder of the Hofnaturalienkabinett, the natural history collections, but also the founder of Schönbrunn Zoological Garden and so on. In the 19th century, after the Brazil expedition that we will come back to in a few minutes, colonial ambitions were most strongly pursued by Ferdinand Maximilian, the brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, and later Emperor of Mexico. The largest project was the Novara Around the World voyage of 1857 to 59, organized by the Academy of Sciences, with Joseph Seleny, a student of Thomas Ender, as embedded painter. The scientists undertook anthropometric studies around the world and made collections of skulls for craniological research. Around 1800, at the time of the Austrian expedition to Brazil, America had already been colonized for 300 years, but was undergoing a kind of rediscovery. The revolution in Haiti had led to the first independence of a French colony. The Spanish and Portuguese empires are shaking, opening up prospects for markets, raw materials, and eventual settlements to other European powers. Scientific travel to South America increases dramatically, philosophical discourse on the continent intensifies, and nature plays a central role in it. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel wrote in the Lectures on the Philosophy of History, "Man is free through the knowledge of nature. Whoever looks at the world rationally, it also looks at him rationally." End quote. Referring to America, Hegel writes, "These parts of the world are not only relatively new, but new at all, in view of their whole physical and spiritual constitution." End quote. Like other European thinkers, he assumed a direct connection between climatic landscape conditions and cultural imprints. He wrote of a natural type of locality which is precisely related to the type of people who are the son of such a soil. End quote. From the geographical, he wrote about the geographical immaturity of America, and from there Hegel's naturalistic theory of culture concludes about the weakness, this is a quote, "a weakness of the American disposition. The relationship between Europe and America is translated into the opposition of culture and nature." I quote again, "Of America and its culture we have news, but merely that the same was a quite natural one, which had to perish as soon as the spirit approached it." So the spirit comes from Europe, of course. Against this background, one can ask about nature in landscape images and scientific descriptions of South America. What is the significance of the seemingly harmless genre of depicting and describing landscape in the context of the colonial imaginary? What is the significance of the representation of nature in the mental concepts of colonialism? How do these representations embody the European sense of self put forward by Hegel? And what do the images contribute to the formation of the same? Now consider two watercolors by Thomas Ender, which were also in the exhibition at the Academy in 2005. They show the view from Corcovado to Gatumbi in exactly the same viewpoint. The first picture, which I project now, is painted on location in Brazil. It's very fleeting, especially in the foreground. It is a rather unspectacular, not particularly exotic-looking landscape with a high proportion of almost empty areas and without narrative elements. If one disregards some vegetal details, it could also be a view of one of the Danube valleys in Enders' Austrian homeland. Quite different is the second picture, painted after the return to Vienna. The small aloe in the foreground, barely visible in the first work, has multiplied and increased in volume threefold. The delicate little trees on the left have almost become the cropped monument of an impenetrable jungle. Overall, the painting has undergone a tropicalist upgrade that completely changes the character of the landscape. Referring to Franz Post, Nancy Lace Stepan wrote, "We could say that the tropics became visually tropicalized." Ender has also added some animals and people. A small group of figures in the foreground forms the narrative core of the painting. A group of black people has settled down by the roadside for a picnic of tropical fruit, and one of them is forced to scare away a snake. Meanwhile, a large lizard is climbing over the rock. In contrast to the first image, the later one fulfills European expectations of the tropical. Nature is alien, fertile, wild, almost excessive, and a little dangerous. Its qualities can be transferred to the people projected into it, at least against the historical background of the analogies of the naturalistic racism of the time. Enders' subsequent tropicalizing and theatricalizing of the original view was carried out when the image, so again, a comparison of the two different versions. So the second version, the tropicalized version, was executed when it came to an illustration of Johann Emanuel Pohl's book Reise im Inneren von Brasilien, Voyage into the Interior of Brazil. A copper plate print. In the 19th century, the journeys of European painters and explorers to South America took place in Humboldt's shadow, to quote the German title of a novel by César Aria about the painter Moritz Rugenders. Alexander von Humboldt had the greatest impact on the European image of South America. Humboldt reinvented South America first and foremost as nature, writes Mary-Louise Pratt. On his journey with the Frenchman Bonpland in 1799 to 1804, he dealt with almost all fields of knowledge, from mineralogy to linguistics. Humboldt is a natural scientist and a man of the humanities, an aesthete in accordance with the theory of the sublime as developed by Kant and Burke and Schiller. Humboldt's image of America is characterized by two qualities. First, by the picturesque. The book titles Views of Nature, 1807, and Views of the Cordillera, 1810, express the visual attitude. In Views of the Cordillera, the numerous engravings are not illustrations of the text, which is remarkable. Rather, each individual image is the trigger of a linguistic description. Humboldt says, or writes, the description of each plate forms, as far as the nature of the object permits, a separate treatise. And in the preface to the other book, Views of Nature, he states his intentions. I quote, overview of nature on a large scale, proof of the interaction of forces, renewal of the pleasure that the direct view of tropical countries affords to the sensitive human being, end quote. But Humboldt also articulated a problem. I quote, richness of nature causes accumulation of individual images, and accumulation disturbs the calm and the total impression of the painting. End quote. So the feeling man on one side, the richness of nature on the other. The Hegelian self-feeling of the European traveler places him and his readers as perceivers in the center of the world. Thus, he affirms the opposition of spirit and nature, of old world and new world. The planetary consciousness, designed by Humboldt, not only enables the European to compare, order, and judge different phenomena and regions, it also lets him produce images as he wishes, through selection and combination, comparable to Post and Enders' tropicalization of the the landscape. Humboldt writes, the fall of Niagara would be even more beautiful if its surroundings were not in the northern zone, but would be adorned with heliconias, palms, and tree ferns. While nature is highly animated in Humboldt's writings, nature speaks to him, offers itself to him, and performs a spectacle for him, humans remain marginalia and emerge from the description of nature as byproducts. Mary-Louise Pratt speaks of the erasure of the human. Primarily, people are mentioned in half sentences as instrumental subjects who carry, remove obstacles, and lead the way. And judgments are made about their attitude toward work. Humboldt writes, people do not undergo strenuous labor in the tropics unless extreme necessity forces them to do. Now, back to the Austrian expedition. The zoologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, teacher of Humboldt, was one of the first and most influential race theorists, co-founder of scientific anthropology and comparative anatomy. In 1795, he published his paper De generis humani varietate nativa, in which he presented his racial typology. Craniology, the measurement of skulls for the purpose of anatomical proof of so-called racial characteristics, was one of his specialties. Blumenbach was instrumental in preparing the questionnaires for the Austrian expedition that related to anthropological studies of indigenous populations. The task of bringing back skulls was also part of the traveler's instructions. The two quasi-ethnologists, the zoologist Natterer and the botanist Pohl, were well integrated into the colonial racist ideology and practice of collecting. To fulfill the mission of collecting indigenous skulls, Natterer requests relevant loot from the leader of a white combat force against an indigenous people and provides instructions on how to preserve them. Pohl, in turn, argues for the education of the indigenous people through forced labor. Natterer, who spent 18 years collecting in Brazil, constantly complains about the laziness of indigenous and enslaved people. While Humboldt positioned himself against the institution of slavery, Natterer owned slaves himself. He defends the institution and sees himself as part of the white civilizing mission. Natterer obtained many of the ethnological objects from the spoils of these military assault troops. Pohl, in turn, brought two indigenous people with him to Vienna, where they were made the object of curiosity. Thomas Ender depicted black people in some of his works. In some texts on his paintings, there is often talk about a critical commentary on slavery. Anyone who reads the texts of his traveling companions, Pohl and Natterer, will not be convinced by this reading. Rather, this reading seems to be an expression of an Austrian wishful thinking of critical observation instead of involvement. Ender's paintings were exhibited until 1836, together with the natural history items, in the Museum Brasilianum, opened in 1821 in Johannesgasse, just a few steps away from the Akademie, which was then located in Annagasse. In the new building of the Natural History Museum, the Brazil-Expedition is immortalized, among other things, by the relief portrait of Natterer in the entrance area and the Rio de Janeiro landscape by Robert Rooij in the rooms designed for the ethnological collection. Inspired by Ender's landscapes, the image here represents the continent of South America. The various exhibition projects of the last 30 years on the Brazil expedition correspond in their own way to Austria's idealized self-image. Like the birds and palm trees in colonial painting, they follow a pattern of repetition and narrowing. What was on display in the showcases of the Academy exhibition in 2005 was also presented in the Ender exhibition of the Academy in 1994, so 10 years earlier. In 2005, I asked what it meant in view of the above-mentioned circumstances of collecting, when in the showcases of the exhibition at the Academy, next to stuffed birds and dried plants, an iron shackle was displayed without comment, alone from the Ethnological Museum from the Nattara collection. Showing a Brazil exhibition every few years has become a habit for Viennese museums. Exotic fantasies, a certain adventurous spirit, identification with the passion for collecting can always be invoked. The museums strive to present the historical enterprises to visitors as valuable contributions in the service of science and the public interest. The discourse of the possessor, as Belinda Kasim-Kaminsky called it in 2009, is born of pride and gratitude for amassing priceless object inventories. In 2001, Nattara was described in the mentioned exhibition, The Discovery of the World, as a producer of knowledge still valuable today and a pioneer of ethnology. In the 2012 catalogue of the exhibition Beyond Brazil, the director of the Museum of Ethnology writes, I quote, "Alexander von Humboldt's voyage to America is certainly one of the most famous, but it cannot be considered the greatest. This honor is bestowed on a still little-known expedition that took its starting point from Austria." So, what do we mean by valuable knowledge? What honor are we talking about? Currently, you can walk a few meters and see the exhibition. The Natural History Museum presents the exhibition Brazil, 200 Years of Relations, from which I have already shown some pictures. For its presentation of the expedition of 1817 and afterwards, it thankfully strives a more critical tone than its predecessors. After that, however, it takes an abrupt turn and loses sight of its subject. If, for example, the various Austrian emigration movements to Brazil, there have been many waves of emigration to Brazil, if they would, for instance, been taken seriously into account, then it would have been possible to see how much the sense of mission and superiority, the notion of a rich nature and social void, and the racist concepts of division of labor were based on the stereotypes established by the voyages of the early 19th century. Ursula Prutsch has done important work on this question. At least one artist who had participated in the Academy's Brazil project in 2004 has in subsequent years critically engaged with the popularized imagination of the American other on a high level. For instance, in the work Les Vues du Brésil, Christian Cosmas Meyer refers to the wallpaper based on paintings by Moritz Rugendas that were popular in the 19th century and with which broader circles could bring the tropics to their homes. But I would like to conclude this lecture with a look at another project, and thus return once more to the Academy. In 2016, 8 watercolors by Thomas Ender were on view in a completely different context. The exhibition Living On, in other words, On Living, was organized by Delal Ischi and Tiago de Paula Sousa. It addressed life or survival after the end of the world that began with colonialism. In the words of the curators, for many societies, the colonial project meant the end of the world, long before today's ecological catastrophe scenarios and the coining of the term Anthropocene. for the geological era determined by man's interference with the earth. In addition to works by contemporary artists, works on genocide, displacement, and exploitative destructions of landscape, the exhibition featured aesthetic productions by indigenous groups in Brazil, responding to such processes, as well as Enders' images from the era of the capitalist scramble for America. Rooij wrote in her review of the exhibition, "The curatorial team clearly sets its narrative in the global south. They simply negate Western supremacy and privilege and image narration by not allowing Western art history or philosophy to be the center of common understanding." End quote. Considered from the perspective of our problem context, the project intelligently demonstrated that it is possible to break out of the routine of repetition and constriction and still think about painting, nature, colonial contexts, and collections. I remember in particular the artifacts of the Kayapo, Tucana, and Karacha. Of course, the headdress made of straws referred to the restitution dispute over the Mexican feather crown, the penacho, in the Weltmuseum Vienna. But objects of the same type from the Natara collection were also on display in the 2012 exhibition Jenseits von Brasilien, Beyond Brazil, at the Museum of Völkerkunde, as it was called today, Weltmuseum. In Living On, the musical instrument, the stool, and the headdress, made of plastic straws instead of bird feathers, were freed from their condition of imperial spoils and their attachment to a violent scientist. Stripped of the dubious ethnomuseum aura, the artifacts were politicized as contemporary interpretations of traditional objects in face of genocide and the scarcity of natural materials originally used. The birds are gone, feathers turned into plastic straws, but their colors glow. Thank you.